Hello and welcome to the Mountebank History of Scotland podcast. This is a series of comedy podcasts all about Scotland's history by me, Daniel Downey. I'm a professional comedian based in Edinburgh. I'm also a historian with a master's degree in Scottish history. And today's episode is part 2 of our mini-series on Darien. Darien is, of course, Scotland's attempt at the end of the 17th century to try and establish a Scottish colony on the Darien Isthmus in Panama. This was Scotland trying to control an important trade choke point in a tiny part of a vast foreign empire that we knew nothing about. It makes the Strait of Hormuz seem that little less ridiculous when you consider that Donald Trump has Scottish ancestry. The geography of dense jungle and the extreme climate of Darien, coupled with the fact that the Scots colonists were being exposed to more diseases than your average wild swimmer in England, rendered the New Caledonia settlement completely uninhabitable. But the colonists, they opted not to mention the horrible conditions in the letters that they wrote home. Instead, they just pretended everything was great and they were having a brilliant time. It was like a holiday in its Centre Parcs. In April 1699, King William, he declared a trade embargo against the Scots colony at Darien in an attempt to appease his Spanish allies whose support he needed against the French. With the Scots now locked out from trading with their supposed allies' colonies, all hope was lost, and the ruling councillors of the Darien colony decided there's no point trying to save this doomed place, let's just liquidate it. They were like the directors of Rangers Football Club. I think Rangers fans will like that joke. They do love the 17th century. In June 1699, the colonists of the first expedition abandoned the Scots colony at Darien. By the time the news of the abandonment of New Caledonia reached home, a second expedition full of hopeful colonists, encouraged by the letters they had received from their Darien counterparts, were already en route. They travelled for 4 months only to be presented by a deserted wasteland. For a similar experience, you can try driving to John O'Groats. This second wave of colonists would last a total of 4 months and 12 days at Darien before disease, starvation, and a decisive Spanish attack on the colony ended Scotland's brief attempt at becoming a colonial power. None of the ships that left on the second Darien voyage made it home safely, and fewer than 1 in 4 colonists survived over the 2 expeditions. Darien was perhaps the most disastrous ordeal suffered by Scottish people until that Willy Wonka experience in Glasgow a few years ago. The fallout of the Darien scheme was momentous. The Scots were furious at King William, who had so callously betrayed them. Never again would a member of the royal family be held in such low standing in Scotland. Although who knows, maybe in years to come we'll be painting murals of Prince Andrew on the gable ends of houses in Scotland and Ireland. Now, if this is the first time you have listened to the Mountebank History of Scotland podcast, then this is the sort of thing that you should expect. It's Scottish history with lots of reform bashing and jokes about the royal family. If that sounds like your thing, you're going to enjoy it. If not, I don't know, get out there and tie a flag to a lamppost somewhere. What are you waiting for? Anyway, without further ado, here is part 2 of your mini-series on Darien and the last episode of this series of the Mountebank History of Scotland podcast. I do hope you enjoy it, have fun out there, and I'll see you all on the other side. Enjoy! The greatest issue facing the colony was disease. The sheer number of diseases the Scots were exposed to at Darien was terrifying. There were mosquito-carrying tropical diseases such as yellow fever and malaria, as well as smallpox, cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and plant diseases, and insects that destroyed crops and agriculture. More diseases were being spread in a foreign climate than on an 18 to 30 holiday. Torrential rains between May and November brought regular flooding and destroyed any crops that the colonists attempted to plant at New Caledonia. And with it raining 5 months of the year, the Scots, they really struggled to adapt to such unseasonably dry conditions. It did not take long for the colonists to realise the geography and climate of Darien made the New Caledonia settlement non-conducive to colonial development. But before the severity of the issues facing them became truly apparent, the colonists had begun in earnest the construction of the major settlement of New Caledonia, New Edinburgh. Houses were built to house the sick, and construction began on a battery on the west side of the entrance to the bay. In an attempt to cement relations with the Chule, a party was sent to meet with local tribe leaders and scout for more suitable settlement sites, and also to see if any of them were eligible for the Scottish football or rugby teams. William Patterson's wife Hannah Kemp died, along with hundreds of others. The population of the settlement was now dwindling, and desertion was becoming a problem. On the 29th of November 1698, two people deserted the colony with arms stolen from the Unicorn. When they were caught, the council at Darien ordered that they be placed in irons and fed only bread and water. Bread, water, and, most importantly, no dessert. This did little to deter other deserters. 7 more abandoned the colony just weeks later, trying to make it to the Spanish settlements of Panama City and Portobello. Worse still was to come when an English captain, Richard Long, who had been trading with the Scots settlement at Darien, informed the colonists that the Spanish were planning an imminent attack on New Caledonia. Yet, despite the setbacks, morale remained high amongst most of the inhabitants of New Caledonia. William Patterson wrote that Darien will, in a small time, be the most flourishing colony and settlement in the East or West Indies. He remained optimistic despite his dead spouse. He was like Erica Kirk. The settlers believed that they could make the colony a viable trading port, and they were confident that if an attack from the Spanish came, that they would be able to fend it off. Their most pressing concern at this stage was to try and establish communications with the directors of the Company of Scotland back in Edinburgh. On the 18th of December 1698, the Darien Council took the decision to send their chief accountant, Alexander Hamilton, home on board a passing French ship named the Maurepas. The propagandist and English spy, Walter Herries, one of the primary chroniclers of the Darien expedition, also travelled home on board the Maurepas. More problematically, however, for the colony, one of the members of the ruling council, Major Cunningham of Eckett, demanded that he also be allowed to return to Scotland. Now, this created a problem, as allowing one of the ruling members of the colony to return home would undermine the confidence and the morale of the colonists at Darien. The council considered holding Eckett by force, but opted in the end to reluctantly consent to his return to Scotland. Their journey home was hit by immediate problems when the Maurepas was shipwrecked on its way out of Darien Bay. This highlighted another significant issue with the settlement. The prevailing northerly winds made sailing into Darien Bay easy, but sailing back out again was almost impossible for large vessels during the dry season. The return party eventually made it to Jamaica and sailed home from there. Hamilton carried with him journals and letters along with a list of the dead. But the letters that he carried with him did not speak of the bleak reality of the situation that the colonists found themselves in. Instead, they were gushingly optimistic, praising Darien's plentiful natural resources and the friendliness of the Chule. The colonists had been encouraged to fabricate their situation by the colony's leaders, who were in desperate need of supplies, trading stock, and people. They did not want to dissuade a second Darien expedition that could bring them the relief that they so desperately needed. The truth, of course, was that New Caledonia was not flourishing. Disease and insufficient provisions were sapping the confidence of the settlers. The lack of food forced the colonists to feast on tiny land crabs, and when they ran out, they were reduced to eating bark off the trees. When things were at their very worst, the Scots colonists were even forced to eat vegetables. At the height of their desperation, news of the long-anticipated attack from the Spanish finally came. In truth, this was not an attack force that the Spanish had sent, but a scouting party of around 25 Spaniards and 12 Chule sent to gather intelligence for a larger Spanish attack down the line. Captain James Montgomery and Captain Robert Drummond intercepted the scouting party and won a much-needed morale-boosting victory for the Scots. But it was a short-lived reprieve. By April 1699, with no word of the arrival of a second expedition, hope was running out. A young ensign named George Douglas wrote, "Half the men are sick, the fortifications will not be ready for another year, and if provisions do not arrive soon, we will surely starve to death." The council called a parliament on the 24th of April 1699 with all captains, lieutenants and ensigns present. And they had to make a decision. They had to make a decision on the future of the colony. The representatives of New Edinburgh, they got together and they decided that the best thing for everyone would be to build more student accommodation. It is a decision that's taken at every meeting of an Edinburgh council. The Parliament drew up rules for good order and government and specified that deserters would now be whipped and serve a week's hard labour for every day of their desertion. Order had been restored briefly, but the nail in the coffin of New Caledonia arrived on the shores of Darien on the 18th of May 1699. It was on this day that the colonists learned of King William's royal proclamation that all trade with the Scots at Darien must cease immediately. A declaration had been made at Jamaica on the 9th of April by the island's governor Sir William Beeston that stated that any person found dealing in arms, ammunition or provisions of any kind with the Scots would be severely reprimanded and punished. Prosecutions would be made if anyone sold anything to Scotland or allowed them to have a second independence referendum. Similar proclamations had been made in Barbados and New York, and this devastating news meant that the Scots could no longer replenish their provisions from English islands or passing English vessels. But it was fine though, because from a strict utilitarian calculus point of view, a pound spent in Croydon was actually more valuable to the Scottish economy than a pound spent in Darien. But why did King William insist that all foreign trade with the Scots at Darien be stopped immediately? Well, the answer is the Spanish were a key ally of the English, and good relations were central to William's wars against the French, support for his dynastic claims, and English foreign policy in general. Under political pressure from representatives of King Carlos II, William therefore took the decision to prohibit all trade with Scotland's colony. The news of the English trade embargo was received at around the same time that rumours were swirling in the West Indies that the Company of Scotland had formally abandoned the colony. And so, in June 1699, another parliament was called at Darien and the decision was taken to abandon New Caledonia. Patterson and Drummond were the two members of the council that were most opposed to the abandonment of the colony. Alternative strategies had been suggested at the Parliament, such as taking to the ships and waiting for resupply from a second Darien expedition. But it should be noted that the settlers at New Caledonia were not convinced that this second Darien expedition was actually coming. Another suggestion was to retain a Scottish presence on the isthmus with a single sloop and around 20 to 30 men. The thought being we should leave someone to claim the sunbeds in case the Germans turn up. But the majority of the council supported the abandonment of the colony. Provisions were divvied up amongst the roughly 900 survivors who made their way back to the ships that had carried them from Leith a year earlier. 300 Scots men and women would remain at Darien, buried at the spot where New Caledonia once briefly existed. Patterson himself had by this point succumbed to fever. He was close to death and was brought on board the Unicorn in a hurry. Others, however, were not so lucky. Those who were deemed too sick to travel were left behind. It's not clear how many people were left at New Caledonia, but estimates range between 6 and 20. On the 22nd of June 1699, the Scottish fleet sailed out of Darien Bay. Malnourished and succumbing to disease, they died in their droves on the journey to Jamaica. When they arrived in Jamaica, many, in desperation, signed up to bonded servitude rather than continue on the journey home. On the journey to Jamaica, 100 people died on board the Caledonia and another 105 on the St. Andrew. The Caledonia then sailed to New York, where another 105 people died when they learned it cost $20 a pint in Manhattan. The Unicorn also limped into port in New York with barely 20 men capable of moving. 20 men barely capable of moving is also an excellent way of describing the current Aberdeen squad. William Patterson estimated that 150 of the 250 people on board the Unicorn died. The Scots presented an apocalyptic vision when they arrived in New York, a physical representation of the horror of their attempt at founding a colony in the New World. Darien had been an unmitigated disaster. Walter Herries described Darien as the back of God's elbow, a place where we could see nothing but death, starvation, and the Spanish mines. His description of New Caledonia, of Darien, was in stark contrast to the picture being painted by the colonists' gushing, optimistic letters, which were now reaching an eager and captive audience back home in Scotland. Just as the colonists were debating the abandonment of New Caledonia, their letters outlining a bountiful tropical paradise were arriving home in Scotland. Darien fever erupted in Scotland as stories enveloped of a tropical paradise and a Darien gold rush. These letters were about as trustworthy and accurate as a Reform UK leaflet, but as the situation worsened for the colonists of New Caledonia, back home in Scotland, enthusiasm for a second Darien expedition only intensified. The shocking news of the abandonment of New Caledonia only reached directors of the Company of Scotland 12 days after the departure of the second expedition. Those currently sailing towards their supposed bountiful paradise knew nothing of the death and destruction that had unfolded at Darien. They had no idea they were sailing towards an abandoned and deserted colony, the back of God's elbow. The flagship of the second expedition, the Rising Sun, was accompanied on its journey to Darien by another company vessel named the Hope. Sun does tend to be accompanied by Hope in Scotland. And two other 300-ton vessels chartered by the company, the Duke of Hamilton and the Hope of Bo'ness. The second expedition was smaller in terms of goods taken. The fleet carried around £5,000 worth of goods, which was less than half the value of the cargo on the first expedition. When it came to provisioning the fleet, conditions had not improved in Scotland. High inflation and food prices only worsened as the 1690s progressed. Nonetheless, thanks in large part to the Darien fever that was being whipped up by the enthusiastic correspondence received from the first wave of settlers, there was no shortage of willing recruits for the second Darien expedition. Everyone wanted to travel across the Atlantic despite the fact it was destined to end in disaster. In their defence, this was the first time that Scotland had qualified for a World Cup in 28 years. The optimistic mood was dampened slightly by rumours the colony had been abandoned, but this was dismissed as English ministers and representatives of the English East India Company trying to undermine the Scots colony at Darien. Some of those who travelled on the second Darien expedition were motivated to find redemption in the New World by their financial embarrassments at home. People such as Michelle Mone, whose incredible financial indiscretions at home forced her to escape abroad. One such man was Andrew Law, a deacon of the Incorporation of Goldsmiths in Edinburgh. Law was a shareholder in the Company of Scotland, but his insolvency drove him to volunteer for the voyage. Writer to the Signet, John Elliott, was another shareholder and subscriber who failed to pay and volunteered his services instead. If you can't pay, you have to volunteer. Thankfully for Donald Trump, he was always able to pay to avoid service. There were men with specialist skills who travelled on the second Darien expedition. Men such as George Winrow, a distiller who travelled to Darien with parts of whiskey stills that were to be assembled on arrival because if we're going abroad, we're going to need some decent whiskey, which is actually a direct quote from my dad while moving through the duty-free at Edinburgh Airport. Another was Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson was a schoolmaster who had spent several years in the West Indies. Johnson had prepared this scheme that was designed to teach the Chule English in as short a time as possible. He'd given up trying to teach it to Scottish people. He travelled to Darien with his wife and daughter. And there was also 4 new councillors who travelled on the second expedition who were to be added to the ruling council of Darien. There was Captain William Veatch, who was the man who had missed the first voyage through illness and was replaced on the council by William Patterson. There was also Captain James Gibson. Gibson was the man who had overseen the construction of the Rising Sun in Amsterdam. He was appointed the ship's captain and commodore of the fleet. The other 2 men were Major John Lindsay and Edinburgh merchant James Byers. On the 21st of July 1699, the directors of the Company of Scotland moved temporarily to Glasgow to oversee preparations for the second expedition. The directors wrote to the council at Darien, reminding them that the cost of provisioning the second expedition was supposed to come from the colony itself. They also instructed the colonists to purchase land north and south of their position on the isthmus from the Chule. Not only did the directors not believe the rumours of the abandonment of New Caledonia, they fully believed that they could branch out from New Caledonia and control the entirety of the isthmus. There were 1,300 people on board the 4 ships of the second Darien expedition. Lessons had been learnt from the first expedition, and the pointless, protracted and dangerous journey around the north of Scotland was avoided, and the fleet left from the Clyde instead. Going to the north of Scotland is dangerous and unnecessary. If only we can get this rumour to take off amongst retired English people. The second Darien fleet left from the Clyde on the 18th of August 1699. There were fireworks the evening before after someone had left a vape on charge, but there was nothing like the scenes of celebration that had accompanied the first Darien fleet's departure from Leith the previous year. The second Darien expedition was struck with some immediate bad luck. Unfavourable winds forced the ships to anchor in Rothsay Bay off the Isle of Bute, and it wasn't until the 23rd of September 1699 that the fleet was finally able to actually leave Scottish waters. Like a passport queue post-Brexit, it took more than a month before anyone was actually able to leave the country. The second Darien sailing across the Atlantic was far quicker. They made it to the Caribbean in half the time. However, deaths on board were even more severe than on the first expedition. When the fleet anchored at the English-controlled island of Montserrat on the 9th of September 1699, 160 people had been buried at sea. And fortunes did not improve for the Scots colonists at Montserrat. The Scots fleet was refused fresh provisions in the Caribbean on account of the English trade prohibitions, and they were once again informed of the abandonment of New Caledonia, and once again they chose to believe that this was just a vindictive rumour that had been started by English saboteurs. The reality of their situation would dawn on them when they finally arrived at New Caledonia on the 30th of November 1699. There was to be no St Andrew's Day celebrations. The sight that greeted the settlers was that of a waste, howling wilderness. The huts of New Edinburgh had been abandoned, the jungle had reclaimed the colony, and the fort was in a state of disrepair. A meeting was held on board the Rising Sun to discuss the grave situation the colonists found themselves in and what steps should be taken next. An examination of the provisions determined that, with rationing, there was enough to last around 6 months, but there was arguments on what to do next. Byers argued that 2 companies of soldiers should be left on the isthmus to maintain a Scots presence, while the rest sailed to Jamaica for provisions. But it was decided in the end that everyone would remain at New Caledonia until the fort was repaired, at which point 500 would remain to hold the colony while the rest sailed for Jamaica. The short rations introduced to preserve provisions created tensions. A rowing boat from the Rising Sun was stolen, and 10 colonists made for the Spanish settlement of Portobello on Panama's east coast. In an increasing atmosphere of paranoia, one of the colonists, Alexander Campbell, was arrested, court-martialed and executed after being accused of a conspiracy to seize ships and escape the colony. Among the captains of the Second Darien expedition was an individual of note, Captain Thomas Drummond. Now, you might recognise that name. Thomas Drummond was the man who had captained one of the regiments that carried out the Glencoe massacre of 1692. Captain Drummond was also arrested for alleged attempted mutiny. He seems like a real standout guy, Thomas Drummond. You know, he wasn't arrested for the massacre, but was, 7 years later, arrested for mutiny. Perhaps that is what's going to happen with Donald Trump. Those colonists who did not mutiny or were not stirred into rebellion likely did so through sheer exhaustion, malnutrition, or illness. They were inactive because they were malnourished. Which might be what's happening with Keir Starmer. I don't know, maybe the guy'd be half decent if we just got him a Barocca. The conditions were absolutely brutal. Food was low, disease was rampant, and all the while, the Spanish were plotting an attack on the colony. The arrival of a minor European nation on the Spanish-controlled isthmus was a dent to Spain's reputation and prestige. If Scotland could control a major trade point in the Spanish Empire, then, quite literally, so could any other European nation who chose to do so. The Spanish simply could not allow the Scots to set up a permanent foothold at Darien. They were duty-bound to destroy us. Here we were with this tiny wee bit of Spain's empire. Of course they had to remove us. I'm still amazed that Gibraltar has held on this long. I mean, honestly, Spain, just take it, for Christ's sake. We have Keir Starmer. Like, what the fuck is he going to do about it? When the Spanish first received intelligence of the Company of Scotland's desire to set up a colony on the Darien Isthmus, King Carlos II's representative in London, the Marquis de Canales, immediately protested to King William's government and to the king personally. Spanish military preparations were put in place not long after the Scots' arrival at Darien. The Spanish planned an attack on the Scots with between 1,200 and 1,500 men in early 1699. However, heavy winter rain prevented the attack, and the Scots won, as we discussed earlier, a small skirmish against the Spaniards in February 1699. Heavy winter rain. It was the most Scottish of all defences. In June 1699, 2 warships and 5 companies of men were dispatched from Spain, and later in the year they were reinforced by an even larger force backed and funded by Pope Innocent XII. Incidentally, by the way, there's been 13 popes named Innocent. I think anyone that feels the need to change their name to Innocent is dodgy as hell. Now that Russell Brand is Catholic, surely he'll be going by the name Innocent Brand any moment now. When the news had reached the directors of the Company of Scotland of the abandonment of New Caledonia, they promptly dispatched 200 soldiers to sail to Darien under the command of a young lieutenant, Alexander Campbell of Fonab. Fonab was given the fairly straightforward orders: repossess yourself by force of arms of our shameful deserted colony. Repossess the old colony. It's probably what we should be doing with the US right now. The soldiers arrived at New Caledonia in February 1700, having travelled via London and Barbados, where Fonab learned of the planned Spanish attack and the reinforcements that were being sent from Europe. He advised the council at Darien that he be allowed to take the initiative and launch a surprise attack against the Spanish. On the 15th of February 1700, Fonab launched a surprise attack on the Spanish frontier post of Tubacante, which housed around 200 Spanish soldiers. Fonab's men, accompanied by a company of Chule, won a hard-earned victory at Tubacante. We took Tubacante, which sounds like we stole their car. Press reports in Scotland claimed a Spanish slaughter, but in truth only 9 Spaniards were killed, with 3 taken prisoner. Nonetheless, there were huge celebrations amongst the beleaguered settlers of New Caledonia. There was excessive drunkenness, profane swearing, ranting, boasting, and singing. But the ecstatic mood did not last long. In late February 1700, Spanish vessels loomed into view on the horizon of Darien Bay. Fonab's company of 200 men were not going to be able to repel this Spanish attack. On the 1st of March 1700, the Spanish assault on New Caledonia begun. It was led by the governor of Cartagena, Don Juan de Pimienta. 500 Spanish soldiers landed east of the settlement and established a beachhead from which they probed the Scottish defences. They launched wave after wave of small attacks and forced the Scots back to the fort, where they had few provisions and little drinking water. The fort was besieged by the Spanish over the preceding weeks, during which time most of the Scots officers were killed and many of the inhabitants of New Caledonia died. On the 31st of March, a conference was held between Captain William Veitch and Pimienta, and the Scots colony was formally surrendered to the Spanish. The Scots were permitted to leave the colony with whatever provisions they had remaining, as well as their arms and ammunition. The Spanish treated the Scots well after the Scots constantly reassured them that they definitely weren't English. Constantly reassuring people that we're definitely not English is a tradition that every single Scottish person upholds to this day when travelling abroad. As part of their surrender, the Scots also insisted that their Chile counterparts who had fought alongside them not be attacked or harassed by the Spanish after the Scots' withdrawal. On the evening of the 11th of April 1700, all the Scots colonists were back on board their ships. In the 4 months and 12 days the second wave of colonists had spent at Darien, 300 died there. In total, 460 of the 1,300 who left Scotland in August 1699 were now dead, and once again, yet more would perish on the disastrous journey from Darien to Jamaica. The journey from Darien to Jamaica was a journey more arduous than Ryanair trying to make it through the Strait of Hormuz. 250 people died on board, and just like on the first expedition, many opted to sign up to indentured servitude in Jamaica rather than face the journey back to Scotland. Ryanair or a lifetime of indentured service. It's a tough call, to be fair. Only the Speedy Return, which was a relief ship sent by the company and arrived in Darien after the surrender to the Spanish, and a sloop that Fonab had purchased in Barbados, actually made it back to Scotland. After its arrival in Jamaica, the Hope of Bo'ness, leaking heavily, was sailed to Cartagena and sold to the Spanish. The remaining colonists at Jamaica who had survived the journey from Darien were transferred onto the Rising Sun, which set sail for New York. On the 3rd of September 1700, the Rising Sun was anchored 9 miles from the harbour of Charleston off the coast of Carolina when it was struck by a devastating hurricane that wrecked it and resulted in the deaths of all 112 people on board. The Duke of Hamilton also went down in the same storm, but it was anchored in Charleston Harbour at the time, and those on board were able to make it to land and to safety. Of the 14 company ships sent to Darien, 11 did not return. That's a wreck rate of 80%, which, to be fair, 80% of vessels being out of action would be considered actually pretty good by CalMax standards. For comparison, the Dutch East India Company had an outward wreck rate of 2% and a return rate of 3.6%. But the Scots, we were always more likely to get wrecked abroad. It's what we do best. This comparison between the wreck rates of the Company of Scotland and the Dutch East India Company highlights the huge advantages joint stock companies with 100 years of experience, backed up with capital, extensive communication networks and powerful navies had over the Company of Scotland. Scotland's sojourn into the mercantile world, quite frankly, could not have gone worse. Thousands were killed, and all of the company's most valuable assets were lost, along with a quarter of the nation's capital. Like Tottenham Hotspur in the Super League, with hindsight, no one can actually believe that we attempted it in the first place. Darien was a disaster on an unprecedented scale. The country was shattered by its failure, and it did not take long for Scotland's grief to turn to anger. And this anger was directed towards the Company of Scotland, but more furiously towards King William. At the turn of the 18th century, after systematically undermining and destroying the Scots colonial project in an attempt to appease his Spanish allies, King William had reached a kind of James Corden level of unpopularity here in Scotland. King William had betrayed his Scottish subjects, many of whom had fought and died for William in the 9 Years' War and Glorious Revolution. On the 21st of May 1700, the Scottish Parliament opened in Edinburgh and a letter from King William was read aloud to MPs. It stated, "The King is heartily sorry for the misfortune and losses the nation has sustained and recommends Scotland should encourage manufactures and improve the native product of the land rather than focus on foreign trade. My bad for all the deaths and fucking up your entire economy." This, by the way, was an everyday statement during COVID. William's patronising words did little to suppress the growing discontent directed towards him. Seditious political pamphlets disparaging the king were widely circulated, and a list of the people of Scotland's groans and lamentable complaints, which outlined the various grievances and injustices Scotland had suffered since the Union of Crowns, was put into wide circulation in Scotland. In this highly charged political atmosphere, nationalist Jacobite sentiment flourished. Jacobites became more vocal, visible, and politically powerful. They called for a breakup of the Union of the Crowns and a return to power of King James VII. Scotland no longer wanted a king based in London. We were sick of having to rely on non-Scots. Except, of course, when it came to our national football and rugby teams. There was, post-Darien, a surge in anti-royal, pan-British sentiment. And yet, in 7 short years, Scotland would find itself not just in a dynastic union, but an incorporating political union with England. And it is this journey towards the 1707 Act of Union that we are going to discuss on the next series of the Mountebank History of Scotland podcast. So that brings us to the end of the episode, folks, and the end of the series. I do hope that you have enjoyed this series of the Mountebank History of Scotland podcast. I'm sorry that I can't put out more than 6 episodes. Each episode is about 5,500 words that I write, research, record, and produce myself. So there's only so many that I can do, but I do appreciate all the support. Sometimes with all the work you put into these things, you feel like you're just shouting into the abyss and nobody's actually listening or engaging to it. So when you review the podcast and give me nice ratings and send messages and stuff like that, honestly, it really, really does give me a big boost, a big lift. So thank you for all the nice messages and the support and all that stuff. I don't normally give authors or academics a shout out at the end of the podcasts. I use so many different sources and books to research these podcasts that it would just take forever. But if you ever want any of that information, you can email me directly. But at the end of this episode, I do want to give a shout out to Douglas Watt and his book, The Price of Scotland, which is by far and away the most comprehensive thing I've seen written about Darien, and it's incredibly detailed and readable as well. I've read so many academic journals on Darien, but his book is just so detailed and readable as well, and it really, really helped with my research. So thank you, Douglas Watt. He does lots of like historical fiction novels, which are really, really cool as well. So the book's called The Price of Scotland. I recommend it highly, and any of Douglas Watt's historical fiction stuff, which I've also read and is also really, really great as well. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed the series. If you appreciate all the work that goes into me producing this podcast, you can give me the price of a cup of coffee or a pint of beer at my Ko-fi, Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon accounts. I'm on all of those at Mountebank Scotland. Give me a follow on social media. I'm on Instagram and TikTok at Mountebank Scotland. If you're in Edinburgh, come on my comedy walking tour or my comedy whiskey tasting. And yeah, review, rate, like the podcast, all that stuff that I've already mentioned. Those of you who listen regularly will know that at the end of each episode, I like to match the events of the podcast with a whiskey from Scotland. And I'm going to match the events of the Darien scheme with Jura. I've not matched any podcast with Jura so far. Jura's a wonderful island in Scotland. They create really, really fruity, flavoursome whiskies. And they have one that is in a rum cask. So, you know, Darien is in the Caribbean. They have a brilliant rum cask whiskey, which I actually bought the other day for £26, which is like crazy, crazy cheap for such a high-class whiskey. I have had the Balvenie Caribbean cask. That's more expensive and honestly not as good. So go on Amazon right now. It's on there for £26 and it's really, really cracking whiskey. So yeah, I think that's everything. Thank you all so much for listening to these last 6 episodes of the podcast. I look forward to the next series. We've got so many great things coming up. It's actually going to be the 320-year anniversary of the Act of Union in 2027. And there's not been a single bump in the road. It's all been very plain sailing in those 320 years. So we're going to be talking a lot about that in the next series. There's big things to look forward to in the 18th century, most notably the Jacobite risings, lots of colourful stuff and interesting stuff coming up. It's nice to bring the 17th century to a close. There was some really difficult, meaty stuff to get into there, but we've come through it together, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you all so much for listening. I really appreciate the support, and I'll see you all next time round. Cheerio then! Bye-bye!